Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the winter CTG. We've got a very exciting morning. Firstly, I'd just like to remind everyone this is a closed session, so please keep the discussion and all the results that you see presented today strictly confidential. The reason for presenting this is because this is a CTG project, but also the manuscript will be submitted very soon in the next few days. And this is the last opportunity for Sandy to get any comments or any suggestions which may be relevant for the manuscript. So please keep the discussion here confidential. If there are any people from the trade displays, could I ask you to leave, please? This is a strictly closed session. Thank you. Just want to put a plug in for our inaugural New South Wales Research Conference that we are running this year. This will be the first time. It'll be a combination of the George Institute annual academic meeting as well as the New South Wales Research Development Group, and as well as we'll feature some college registrar presentations as well. So the first speaker today is Professor Sandy Peake. She's a senior intensivist at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Adelaide, professor at the University of Adelaide. She was the chair of ARISE and co-chair of Target with Mary Ann Chapman. I'd like to send my personal congratulations for a fantastic job with the Target study, and also congratulate everyone else who was involved with the study. So it's a fantastic job. And so it's with great pleasure I invite Sandy to come up to tell us the results.
Thanks, Winston. If I could just make one additional comment to the confidentiality, please, no photos. The slides are fantastic, but no photos, and certainly no tweeting or any other social media. So, as many of you would be aware who follow the literature on nutrition, the literature is replete on how we should be feeding our patients. Nonetheless, despite a plethora of articles telling us what we should or should not be doing, there's a number of questions which remain unresolved, including when's the right time to commence feeding, what route we should be using, and what are the optimal energy and protein goals. In 2016, the Aspen guidelines were released, and they recommended that for critically ill adult patients they receive a weight-based equation to achieve energy goals, and that being 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day. And this recommendation, as you can see here, is based on expert consensus. Moreover, they recommended that enteral nutrition be used over parenteral nutrition, and again with very low to low quality of evidence to support that recommendation. There are no large, double-blind, randomised controlled trials examining whether full delivery of currently recommended energy goals using enteral nutrition alone can improve survival. Further, despite these recommendations, we typically don't deliver our full recommended energy goals. In multiple observational studies examining usual practice, only around 50 to 60% of prescribed goals are typically delivered. Moreover, when one looks at trials of enteral nutrition where at least one of the arms of the trial has included full delivery of enteral nutrition, the number of calories delivered is around 15 kilocalories per kilogram per day, which falls short of the recommended 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day. In 2014, we published a feasibility study prior to conducting the Target trial to look at whether delivering a concentrated enteral nutrition solution, that being a 1.5 kilocal per mil formulation, could deliver full calorie goals. And what we found in that feasibility study was that we were able to deliver 46% more calorie goals, and moreover there was a suggestion that mortality was in fact improved when full calorie goals were achieved. So the aim of the TARGET trial was to test the hypothesis that increasing calorie delivery using an energy-dense enteral nutrition formulation can increase 90-day survival when compared to routine care in mechanically ventilated patients. This was a 4,000-patient, investigator-initiated, double-blind, randomised trial conducted in 46 ICUs in Australia and New Zealand. The trial was funded by the NHMRC and the HRC in New Zealand, and it was endorsed by the CTG. The trial was run out of the ANZAC Research Centre, and the MRINZ in New Zealand were involved for the New Zealand sites. The trial was supported by Fresenius Kabi, however they played no role in either the design, conduct, analysis or writing of the manuscript. It was also supported by the CRE in Translating Nutritional Science in Adelaide, and the study was overseen by an independent DSMC, which was chaired by Deborah Cook. The inclusion criteria: patients had to be 18 years of age or older, they had to be receiving invasive mechanical ventilation, and they had to be about to commence enteral nutrition, or if enteral nutrition had already been commenced, it could only have been running for less than 12 hours. And patients were expected to receive enteral nutrition in the ICU until at least the day after tomorrow. Exclusion criteria were patients who'd received more than 12 hours of EN or PN in this current ICU admission, or if the study goal rate was clinically contraindicated, and that was 1 ml per kilogram of ideal body weight per hour, or if specific nutritional therapy was required. Other exclusion criteria were the standard types of inclusion criteria in many of our trials, such as death deemed imminent or inevitable and survival to 90 days unlikely due to an underlying disease. We used an opt-out or delayed consent approach, given that patients were all mechanically ventilated and unable to provide their own consent. If consent was subsequently withdrawn, then patients received standard nutrition, and where this happened, we asked for consent to use the data that had been collected to date and also 90-day follow-up. So patients were randomised using a web-based system, one-to-one, stratified by site, and they received either the energy-dense enteral nutrition, which is Fresibin energy fibre tube feed, which has a concentration of 1.5 kilocalories per mil, or routine enteral nutrition, Fresibin 1000 complete tube feed, which has an energy content of 1 kilocal per mil. And the increase in energy content between the two feeds was shared between carbohydrate and fat. The study goal rate was the same for both treatment groups, as I said, 1 ml per kilo of ideal body weight per hour, which equated to 24 mL per kilo of ideal body weight per day. And the maximum goal rate was set at 100 mL per hour, so if someone had a BMI of 120, which is quite unlikely, they received 100 mL per hour. And the aim was to commence the enteral nutrition as soon as possible after randomisation and to achieve the recommended goal rate within the first 48 hours. All other aspects of nutritional management other than the goal rate were according to local practice. So sites determined when they actually wanted to start a patient on enteral nutrition and when enteral nutrition was no longer required. They determined the rate at which they started the study enteral nutrition and also whether or not strategies were required and what strategies to increase study EN delivery. We recommended that blood glucoses be kept at 10 or less. So the study EN intervention period lasted for 28 days whilst the patient was present in the ICU and still requiring enteral nutrition. So when patients commenced oral nutrition or they developed specific nutritional needs, then the study EN was ceased. Or if the patient was readmitted to the ICU and EN was ceased at that point, when they got readmitted to the ICU, if they still required enteral nutrition, then they received the same allocated study EN. If patients were deemed to need supplemental parenteral nutrition, then where possible we recommended that the study EN be continued at the same time. So our primary outcome was all-cause mortality at 90 days after randomisation. We had a number of secondary outcomes, including survival time to day 90, cause-specific mortality, hospital and 28-day mortality, ICU and hospital-free days, and the receipt of organ support and organ support-free days, invasive ventilation, vasopressors, and renal replacement therapy. We're also interested in looking at infectious complications, but being a pragmatic trial, we kept these fairly simple and collected the number of positive blood cultures and the number of patients receiving intravenous antimicrobials throughout the 28-day intervention period. The sample size of 4,000 patients was based on an assumed mortality of 20 to 30%, and we derived that from data from the Target feasibility study, where the mortality in the true treatment arms was 20% versus 37%, and also data from ventilated patients in the ANZAC's core APD. We allowed for 6% sample size inflation for loss to follow-up, and with 4,000 patients we had 80% power to detect a 3.8 to 4.3% difference in 90-day mortality. We pre-specified and pre-published our statistical analysis plan shortly before we finished recruitment. All analyses for our primary outcome were based on the modified intention to treat principle. We also conducted a sensitivity analysis per protocol and as treated for both the primary outcome and also for our secondary outcomes. And our primary outcome was reported as a relative risk with 95% confidence intervals. And we did both an unadjusted relative risk but also an adjusted risk for both site and also for predefined baseline covariates, being age, gender, BMI, Apache 2 score, medical versus surgical patients, and the region. Just briefly, just to describe what the three populations are. So the modified intention to treat was all patients, excluding those patients for whom consent was withdrawn and permission to use data was refused. And in addition, patients who not only did not meet the eligibility criteria, but also did not receive the study enteral nutrition. So they had to meet both of those conditions to be excluded from the modified intention to treat population. The per protocol analysis was the MITT population, excluding those patients who had one or more protocol deviations. And the as treated analysis was patients who received more than 70% of their study EN as the correct treatment. We had a number of subgroups predefined. They were aged, dichotomised at 65 years, the ICU admission category, diagnostic subgroups, trauma versus no trauma, neurological versus non-neurological, sepsis versus no sepsis, and absolute risk of death based on the ANZROD score in quintiles, as well as quartiles of BMI based on the World Health Organisation categories. And these subgroup analyses were unadjusted for the primary outcome. We had intended to conduct one interim analysis, and that was meant to be at 2,000 patients, so 50% of recruitment, which we thought was fairly reasonable and standard for a large trial. What we realised was that if we conducted the interim analysis at 2,000 patients, by the time we allowed 90-day follow-up, the trial would have been finished in terms of recruitment before the DSMB could actually conduct their interim analysis. So in the last, between the beginning of August, between the beginning of August and November the 14th, when we finished recruitment, we actually recruited 1,000 patients in just over 3 months. So we had to bring forward the interim analysis to 1,500 patients, which is probably a first, I suspect. So we can just see briefly here the timeline. The first patient was recruited on 21st of June 2016, and as I said, the last patient was 14th of November, with the last day 90 follow-up on the 12th of February. So, the results. There were 5,920 screening episodes where all of the inclusion criteria were met. 1,743 patients met one or more exclusion criteria. An additional 177 were eligible for enrolment but were not randomised because consent was either refused or there was a variety of other reasons why they were not randomised, some of which related around study logistics and so on. So we randomised 4,000, and within that there were 1,997 allocated to the 1.5 kilocal per mil group and 2,003 to the 1 kilocal group. There were a number of other exclusions from the modified intention to treat population. There were 5 patients in total, 3 in the 1.5 and 2 in the 1 kilocal per mil group who did not meet the eligibility criteria and did not receive the study intervention. We had a number of patients who withdrew consent at that stage, and there was actually 1 patient who was randomised twice within the same ICU admission, so that second randomisation episode was excluded from the MITT population. Then looking at loss to follow-up, there was an extremely small loss to follow-up, which is a tribute to the diligence and perseverance of all the sites. There was a total of 15 patients in the 1.5 group who were lost to follow-up and only 9 patients in the 1 kilocal group that were lost to follow-up. So 24 patients out of 4,000, which is phenomenal. That left 1,948 patients in the 1.5 group available for the primary outcome and 1,966 in the 1 kilocal group. So the baseline characteristics, 57, age in both treatment groups and predominantly male, 61% versus 64%. The ideal body weight for both treatment groups was 64 kilograms. However, the actual body weight was 84 kilograms. But as I said, it was the ideal body weight that we used to determine the study goal rate. The BMI of both groups verged on obesity with a BMI of 29, with 30 being defined according to the WHO as the obese category. And the majority of the patients were non-operative, 73% and 72%, with the next most common population being emergency surgical, so very few elective surgical patients. We had a high Apache 2 score of 22, and when we looked at the ICU admission diagnoses, the majority were cardiovascular, respiratory and neurological in both treatment groups. 7% of patients in both groups were receiving insulin as a comorbidity, and there are a number of other cardiovascular diseases in small proportions. 100% of patients in the 1.5 kilocal group received ventilation. As you may recall, that was a study entry criteria. There were, in fact, at the time of randomisation, 3 patients who weren't mechanically ventilated in the 1 kilocal group, although subsequently they did go on to become ventilated, which is why this is 99.8 and not 100. 60% or over 60% of our patients were receiving vasopressors at the time of randomisation, and just under 10% were receiving renal replacement therapy. We did collect data on clinician estimated nutritional requirements, although these were not used to determine the study goal rate and were only collected if sites perform these measurements as part of their routine practice. And in those sites where it was performed, the estimated requirements were around 1,800 kilocalories per day. The median time from patients getting admitted to the intensive care unit to then undergoing randomisation was 14 hours in both treatment groups. Now, as I said earlier, the time to initiate enteral nutrition was entirely at the discretion of the ICU clinicians. So what that tells us is, in ANZ at least, our feeding practice is to feed patients very early, even patients who are ventilated and on vasopressors and on dialysis. The study goal rate in both treatment groups was approximately 1,500 mils per day. In terms of what we actually delivered, the study intervention was delivered for a median of 6 days in both treatment groups, with an interquartile range of 3 to 11 days. And the volume delivered was approximately 1,200 mils in both treatment groups, which was not different, and this equated to 81% in the 1.5 kilocal per mil group and 82% in the one group of their goal rate. For patients who did receive supplemental parenteral nutrition, this only occurred in 5% and 4% of patients and was not different between the two treatment groups. So in terms of volume delivery, both feeds delivered the same volume of feed, but where they differed was in the amount of calories that were delivered. So the 1.5 group delivered 1,863 kilocalories per day as compared to 1,262 kilocalories per day in the 1 kilocal group, which was statistically significant, p less than 0.001. When we look at the energy delivery in kilocalories per kilogram per day, this was 29.1 versus 19.6 kilocalories per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. There was a small increment in calorie delivery when we included in all sources, and this included not only the study EN but non-study EN, parenteral nutrition, dextrose solutions, propofol, and also where patients were receiving citrate dialysis, the calories from citrate. So what this meant was that with the 1.5 kilocal per mil formulation, we were able to deliver 47.6% more calories than the 1 kilocal per mil patients. This equated to a mean difference of 601 kilocalories per day with 95% confidence intervals of 576 to 626 mils. What this means is that using the energy-dense enteral nutrition, we were able to truly, for the first time ever, deliver full guideline-recommended daily energy delivery with enteral nutrition. This is the graphic representation of the daily energy delivery over the 28-day intervention period. In the top graph, we can see that the volume of the volume of enteral nutrition delivered across the 28 days was identical in the two treatment groups, but in the left-hand side we can see the calories from study EN, and on the right the calories per kilogram, with clearly a marked separation between the two treatment groups. We can also see that on the very bottom of the slide is the numbers of patients who were still receiving study intervention at the 7, 14, 21 and 28 days, and even out to 28 days there were still patients in the ICU who were receiving the study enteral nutrition. Not a lot, but around about 4%. We did find that with the increased calorie content in the 1.5 formulation, there was an increase in the upper gastrointestinal intolerance. When we looked at gastric residual volumes, the largest single gastric residual volume on an individual day collected each day whilst the patients were receiving the study EN was higher in the 1.5 group, 250 mils versus 180 mils, and this was significant. The median difference was 40 mils with a range of confidence intervals of 30 to 50. There was also more EN regurgitation or vomiting, 18.9% versus 15.7%, and more promotility use, 47.4% versus 39.6%, all of which were statistically significant, but no difference in the number of bowel actions. As I said earlier, we recommended that sites try and achieve, although it was not mandated, a glucose of 10 or less. Patients in the energy-dense group received more insulin, 55.8% versus 49%. And they also received a greater dose of insulin as well, the median being 3 units per day versus 0 in the 1 kilocal per mil group. And that was across all patients in both treatment groups, whether they did or didn't receive any insulin. Patients in the 1.5 group also had higher daily blood glucoses, although one could argue whether it's clinically significant, but it certainly was statistically significant, 12.5 versus 11.8 millimoles per litre. But no difference in the lower blood glucose with the 1 kilocal formulation. We're obviously interested in refeeding, although most typically refeeding is described with parenteral nutrition, and we're a bit unsure whether in fact you can actually get refeeding with enteral nutrition. So we collected electrolytes on the first 7 days patients were receiving a study EN, and whilst we found a statistically significantly lower potassium and phosphate in the 1.5 group, one could hardly say that this was clinically significant. For potassium was 3.5 versus 3.6 and phosphate 0.67 versus 0.72. We're also interested in whether delivering an increased energy load would have some effect on ventilation, respiratory effects. So we looked at some ventilation parameters, and the median highest daily PaCO2 was not different between the two treatment groups, and the minute volume and respiratory rate associated with that PaCO2 were also not different between the two treatment groups. When we look at the reasons why patients cease study EN, the majority centred around patients having their feed held for endotracheal tube removal and then the study EN not being recommenced, or patients being discharged from ICU. The next two commonest reasons for ceasing study EN were that oral diet had commenced or that patients were deemed by the clinician to be no longer suitable for enteral nutrition. The sites did an amazing job when we had extremely high adherence with the study protocol. As I said earlier, patients who had a major deviation were excluded from the per protocol analysis, and we can see in the left-hand panel here that there were very few patients who weren't eligible, who never received study EN, got non-study EN when they should have been receiving study EN, or received the incorrect allocation. The most frequent major deviation was patients who received a goal rate more than 10%, patients who received a rate of delivery more than 10% above their study goal rate. And this occurred in 11 and 12% of patients. But if you actually broke that down and looked into the number of feeding days that they received this high goal rate, it was 1.6 versus 1.8 feeding days. Now, given the average median feeding days was only 6 days, 1.6% of 6 feeding days is not particularly high. So, primary outcome. Everyone will immediately look at the Kaplan-Meier, and it looks pretty similar in both groups. So the 1.5 kilocal per mil group, 523 patients had died by day 90, which is 26.8%, versus 25.7% in the 1 kilocal group. This equated to a relative risk of 1.05 with 95% confidence intervals of 0.94 to 1.16. So increasing energy delivery was not associated with improved survival. When we looked at the adjusted analysis, as I said, this was for site and predefined baseline covariates. This did not change our results, nor did the per protocol analysis or the as treated analysis, with the results being the same for the primary outcome. Secondary mortality outcomes, again, no different between the two treatment groups. Hospital discharge 23 days in both groups and death by day 28, 23 in both groups. And this was both for the unadjusted and the adjusted analyses. Cause-specific mortality overall was different between the two treatment groups, but it centred around hypovolemic shock, which had confidence intervals of 1 to 70.96. And also in metabolic, which was confidence intervals of 1.4 to 12.6. And when we went back and looked at all the approximate causes of death, it became really apparent that the differences in cause-specific mortality really related to how sites were coding or categorising patients, and they weren't different between the two treatment groups when one actually looked at actual individual causes. We did, however, do a fragility index and found that a difference of 3 patients between the two groups would have meant that this 0.02 was non-significant. So we don't think this is of any clinical relevance. Other secondary outcomes, ICU free days were 17 in both treatment groups and hospital free days 2.9 in both treatment groups. 100% of patients in both groups were ventilated with no difference in ventilator-free days. Around 80% in both groups received vasopressors. Again, no difference in vasopressor-free days, and the same for renal replacement therapy, no difference. As I said, we were interested in effective complications, but there was no difference in the number of patients who had a positive blood culture, nor in the number of patients who received intravenous antimicrobials up to day 28. The subgroup analyses, again, no statistical difference between the two treatment groups, although it perhaps is interesting to note that for most of the point estimates, they tend to favour or lie on the side of favouring the 1 kilocal per mil group. The only ones which were favouring the 1.5 that are of note are the BMI, which the point estimate is favouring a high calorie delivery, which is against current recommendations that obese patients receive a hypocaloric enteral nutrition regime. And the only other one which I particularly found interesting was that the age of greater than 65 almost doesn't cross the null line, and to me that doesn't seem surprising because I think as you get older your metabolic rate goes down and you don't eat as much, so maybe older patients do not benefit from receiving more calories. So in summary, TARGET is the largest blinded randomised controlled trial of enteral nutrition conducted in the critically ill. It's the first RCT to deliver full recommended calories with enteral nutrition in the critically ill. Our recruitment rate was phenomenal, which is a testament to the sites. We had a high level of adherence to the protocol, again a great testament to everybody that participated in the trial and enrolled patients. However, despite delivering full recommended calories, we found no evidence of survival benefit or with any of the secondary outcomes associated with energy-dense nutrition, and our results do not support the current guideline recommendations of 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram. So I guess at this point, just 3 more slides, sorry Winston. I just want to say thank you very, very much to everybody who's participated in this trial. It's been an amazing effort by everyone, and all your efforts have not gone unnoticed. We had nearly 60,000 bags of EN, over 7,000 boxes of study EN. There was nearly 200 shipments to sites. We recruited approximately 8 patients a day, up to a maximum of 25 patients per day, which is, given we had 46 sites, is each site, or half the sites contributing a patient every day, and there's over 3.6 million data points that we've had to analyse. And I think I've gone grey, but I've just been to the hairdresser. So this is a big thank you and acknowledgement to all the sites. You've done an amazing job, as have all of the Target management team. Marianne, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, has been a fantastic co-chair to work with. Lorraine Little has been absolutely stellar, and Sally and Di New Zealand have done a great job taking some of the workload off Lorraine by looking after the New Zealand sites, and all of the management committee, and in particular those members of the management committee who also are part of the working party. You've all done an amazing job, so thank you very much.
Okay, congratulations again, Sandy. Any questions?
Blow my nose now.
Vinit.
Sandy, thanks very much. One of the protocols in Target was to try and achieve the target level of feeds within 48 hours. I saw in your results that part of the data was not presented, or was maybe something that might have been presented, I might have missed it, i.e. the time from the time of randomization to actually achieving the target level of feeds.
Well, you can actually see that on the graphs. So in the first, the patients received at their full goal rate around 1,600 calories, but in the first 24 hours to 48 hours, it was more like 1,200, 1,400, and then by 48 hours, they were at the rate. I mean, as you saw from the presentation, no one actually received the goal rate. It was, you know, slightly less. It was 1,500 versus what should have been 1,800, but where it plateaued at was at the 48 hours. So it took 2 days to actually get to that goal rate, but it wasn't significantly lower. It wasn't like, you know, 500 mils or 1,000 mils in the first day.
I still wondered on the table whether you could have a median time that you could demonstrate. If you've got a median time to, from the admission, ICU admission to randomization.
Yeah, sure.
Median time from the randomization to start of the administration to study.
Yeah, that was 15 hours.
Yeah, I saw.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm just saying that there could be an additional line that could be placed. It's just a suggestion.
Thank you.
So, Sandy, first of all, congratulations, and to you and everyone who designed that. I mean, it was obviously the two hospitals I work in were both involved, and it's a wonderful example of, if you want a study to go well, design it well, and your inclusion criteria and the intervention, etc., were very simple, and the recruitment rate is spectacular. So congratulations on that. I had a couple of little questions. One, the median insulin dose was 3 units per day.
That's across all of the patients
So
over
that
the whole 28 days
Right.
in the 1.5 group.
So that includes people who had 0?
Yes, that's right.
Right, okay. So that kind of makes sense. So the other group that had less than 50% had insulin. It's got
Medium
to be,
zero.
It's got to be
We have
0.
got the data
Yeah.
on the
Okay.
insulin dose for those that just got insulin, but I only presented this because to me that is more relevant than the patients who actually got the insulin.
I agree with you.
Oh, good.
Lots
Thank
of-
you.
It should always be the whole group.
We
But
started
lots
off,
of
but
people
we-
want to describe the amount of, you know, renal replacement therapy, ventilation, etc., in the people who receive it, which I agree with you is wrong. The second, my second, maybe a little surprise was it 9% with sepsis?
Yeah, it
And
was.
what
That was
were
the
you-
ICU admission diagnosis, but in
Right.
actual fact, I didn't go into detail about the sepsis because it was slightly complicated. So we collected sepsis in 2 different ways, in that those ICU admission categories were what the sites actually said as their ICU admission diagnosis.
Right.
But when it came to collecting the baseline variables, we did particularly want to look at the patients with sepsis. So we actually collected information at the time of randomisation on patients who were thought to have an infectious source and met the new sepsis 3 criteria and were on vasopressors. So the incidence at the time of randomisation was in fact higher than that 9% that was on that ICU admission diagnosis.
And that's what you used for the subgroup analysis?
Yes, and that's what we used for the subgroup analysis, which was the sepsis at randomisation, not the ICU admission diagnosis. But I think I just didn't go into that because it's just sake of brevity, but that's how we did it.
I have a vague interest in sepsis, so it kind of stuck out a bit.
Yeah, no, sure.
Sandy, well done, that's excellent. You said that they were all quite early feeding centres. I think it was 14 or 15 hours was the median time. Do you have any idea of what the outcome might be between the two groups for those who would feed later?
We haven't looked at that, no. No, because, I mean, at the end of the day, that's actually may be determined by the intervention itself, so tolerance, for example, and so on. So, no, we haven't actually broken it down into patients who got feeds later. I mean, in our own practice, we feed late. So we're definitely an outlier onto that median of 14 hours, and there were sites that some patients, so the interquartile range was out to, I can't remember, it was out like 12 days or something like that. So there are sites who do get it later, or for clinical reasons don't need it till later.
Yeah, and you didn't analyse based on the later feeders versus the earlier feeders?
No.
Thanks, Sandy, and again, congratulations. Stellar effort, and echo what Simon said. Just a quick question about the different costs of the two solutions.
They're almost the same.
Are they? So there's no big cost saving there?
No.
Okay.
No.
Really interesting. So,
I mean, I don't have the exact figures, but they're basically the same.
yeah.
Probably one of the dietitians, if there's one in the audience, could tell us the difference in cost, but it's marginal.
Yeah, Sandy, good morning. Andrew Ching. Well done. Fantastic achievement. I think the recruitment rates for the study were particularly outstanding for me, I think, and I think a testament to the sites obviously involved in this study. Look, one of the things that stood out for me from this study was the fact that clearly we're focused on the first week of critical illness. 6 days was the median duration, wasn't it, on treatment? Mm-hmm. And I note that there was no difference in the protein delivery in both groups. Yeah. I can't remember what the protein content was in the high calorie feed. Was that intentional? The protein
content was identical in the two treatment groups, so they received the same amount of protein, and they basically both got 1 gram per kilogram per day. It was identical. Okay. And that was why so we went with the Fresenius feed for a couple of reasons. We needed to have feeds which obviously had difference in energy content, but we wanted them particularly to have the same protein content, so that way we could isolate out the effect of energy delivery without complicating it by differences in protein delivery. And then the last and perhaps most important factor in choosing the feed was we needed to have 2 feeds that had the same colour, because it was a blinded trial, and a lot of feeds with increasing energy content, the feed becomes darker, and Fresenius had the 2 products that were clinically indistinguishable in terms of colour and the same protein.
Okay, got it. Yeah, thanks.
I have the last question from Craig.
I had one too. Yeah, thanks, Sandy, and thanks again for the presentation, Sandy. It was great. The gastrointestinal intolerance data with the higher gastric residual volumes, when overall the same volume was being administered to the patients, but the gastric residual volumes are different. Do you have any theories as to why that might have been?
Well, actually, when I say it was the same, the volume delivered was actually, if you looked at the median difference between the 2 groups, was 40 mils, but that was significant. I think part of it also relates to they had more pro-motility agents, and maybe also whether sites return their feed and so on, the aspirates.
Sandy, can I just ask one quick question? Just because there's no difference in mortality between the 2 groups, but
one of the outcomes that might be important is how patients perform with slightly more energy delivery in terms of physical function. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what we might expect from some of the other data you've collected in the future?
No, because we haven't looked at it yet. We have actually collected 6-month mortality and 6-month functional outcomes, but we haven't looked at that at all yet. So that's coming next year, and Adam's leading the, I don't know where Adam is, Adam's leading the functional outcomes data.
Well, thanks again, Sandy.